This is Bloomberg Law with June Grasso from Bloomberg Radio.
U.S. troops in the Middle East remain on high alert as Israel and Iran appear to be honoring a ceasefire agreement unexpectedly announced by President Donald Trump last evening. This morning, Trump was reacting angrily to reports of early breaches of the deal by both sides.
Now I hear Israel just went out because they felt it was violated by one rocket that didn't land anywhere. That's not what we want, I'll tell you. And I'm telling you, I'm not happy about that, Israel, either.
Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war, and the War Powers Act requires the president to consult with Congress before using military force. Democrats and some Republican lawmakers are critical of President Trump's decision to attack Iran's nuclear sites because Trump didn't get approval from Congress or consult with lawmakers beforehand. Here are Democratic House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski.
The role of Congress is very clear under Article 1. It is the Congress that has the ability, the authority to declare war. And so I think you will see that conversation, that debate move forward this week.
But Trump administration officials have called the strikes limited actions aimed solely at Iran's nuclear capabilities that don't meet the definition of war. Here's Secretary of State Marco Rubio on Fox News on Sunday.
This is not a war against Iran. This is very simple. 67 days ago, the President of the United States sent the Iranians a letter, and it said, you're not going to have nuclear weapons. You're not going to have a militarized nuclear program. Let's negotiate. I want to do this diplomatically. I want to do this peacefully. They tried to play him along the way they've played every American president for the last 35 years. And, the president told them, if we don't get a deal, which is what he wanted, then I'll have to handle it differently.
My guest is Joshua Kastenberg, a professor at the University of New Mexico Law School and a former judge and prosecutor in the U.S. Air Force. So, Josh, Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. Article 2 designates the president as commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. And sometimes those two may seem to be in conflict.
Yeah, so the framers of the Constitution, in order to create checks and balances on the federal government and keep it a government of limited power, gave to the Congress of the United States the sole authority to declare war. So historically, what had happened prior to World War II is that the president would go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war. And in our major conflicts with foreign countries, that's exactly what happened, and that included the Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War, the War of 1812. Some of these were closed votes. Certainly the War of 1812 was a closed vote. World War I, the declaration of war against Germany, you had 50 members of Congress voting no on it. So it was not unanimous. But after World War II, Congress stopped declaring war. With the Korean War, which Truman and others called the police action, they at least had the United Nations with the Security Council resolution empowering the United States and allies to go maintain the integrity of the Republic of Korea. In Vietnam, there was no declaration of war. There was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. No matter how flawed that was, only 2 members of Congress voted against empowering Lyndon Johnson to ante up greater forces and respond to attacks committed against United States military forces in both North and South Vietnam. You've had authorizations for the use of force in Afghanistan and in Iraq, Security Council resolutions from the UN with Operation Desert Storm. But over and over again, our presidents are bypassing Congress, and they're also ignoring the War Powers Act of 1973.
So what about these strikes on Iran ordered by the president without consulting Congress? Are they unconstitutional?
In this case, a strike on Iran, you're going to hear legal scholars on both sides, and then you're going to hear our Justice Department say, well, the president had the authority to launch a single strike against Iran. Now, the president has the authority to respond to attacks on the United States without a declaration of war. And under international law and common sense, you'd be hard-pressed to argue otherwise. But there's no clear answer here as to whether the United States was actually threatened at this time by Iran. And Trump did not go to Congress. He informed some Republicans that we were likely to strike Iran because they had moved closer to the production of a nuclear weapon. But that's far short of asking Congress for permission to go ahead and do it. The Justice Department gave very tepid support to it and said he had the authority to do it under the Constitution, but probably go no further. But unlike even in Syria, where Congress has funded military operations, there's no specific funding that anyone could point to that would give Trump the outright, legal authority to launch strikes into Iran. So what we're left with is there something that a president has under the Constitution that's not written in the Constitution that's inherent that would allow the president to strike under these circumstances or not? And, by and large, Congress has decided not to weigh in on these issues. They had an opportunity to do it with the Nixon impeachment in 1974 over Nixon's expansion of the war into Cambodia, but the senior Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee said, no, we're not going to include that as an article of impeachment. We've got them on the other stuff. And ever since then, Congress has given presidents a pass for violating the War Powers Act. You'll hear members of Congress on both sides say it's illegal, it's unconstitutional, but those are usually members on the extreme wings of their party, the Rand Pauls or the AOCs doing that. And so unfortunately, Congress has kind of acquiesced to this idea of a more empowered president than ever before, and the courts won't rule on it.
You mentioned the War Powers Act of 1973. Tell us what that requires of the president and how it fits in here.
So, if you go back to the Vietnam conflict and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, Congress wanted to sort of make amends for punting on the war and allowing Lyndon Johnson to go from 16,000, military advisors under the Gulf of Tonkin resolution to almost 600,000 servicemen and women fighting in the Vietnam War, and also make sure that a president does not expand wars like Nixon did into, the aerial attack in Cambodia in 1969 and the invasion in 70 and then the air war again in 1972-73. So in 1973, Congress passes this War Powers Act. Nixon vetoes it, but then Congress passes it over the veto. So it's a really robust act. And here are the provisions of the act, that if there's an absence of a declaration of war by Congress, the President of the United States has to routinely consult with Congress until U.S. armed forces are no longer engaged. Now, we know that didn't happen in this incident. I mean, obviously it was a one-time airstrike, but it seems to me that there was a violation of the War Powers Act when President Trump brought in a couple of trusted Republicans into the office and said, hey, we're going to go ahead and do this. The president has to do it in 48 hours in writing to the Speaker of the House of Representatives after the strike. That didn't seem to be done either. Then there's other parts of the War Powers Act which don't necessarily apply right now, but they could. And that is if the president deploys ground forces or air forces past 60 days, it would need congressional approval to do so. And I don't think that's going to come into play, considering Trump has argued that there's a ceasefire that exists, and there seems to be something of a tenuous ceasefire. But presidents before Trump seem to have violated the War Powers Act in Somalia, former Yugoslavia with Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and the like. On the other hand, one could make the argument that if you have forward deployed B-2 bombers in Diego Garcia or Guam poised to strike Iran again, the president has to get specific approval from Congress to do that. They're going to say he doesn't, and I think you'll hear some grumbling in Congress. Some Democrats will say he does, but it'll go nowhere. Has
anyone tried to get the courts involved in this before?
Yeah, so what the courts have said basically is that this question is a non-justiciable political question. In other words, it's outside of the competency of the federal judiciary to rule upon. It's a political question, and therefore it goes to the Congress to do with what they may. They can impeach a president. They have the power of the purse, they can inquire and the like. But the courts simply will not respond directly on this point. And, on top of that, there have been members of the Supreme Court, Scalia notably, that questioned whether the War Powers Act was even constitutional. But again, that act has never seen the light of day in the Supreme Court because of the political question doctrine.
Coming up next, what about an authorization for the use of military force? President George W. Bush was the last U.S. president to successfully seek one in separate request for Afghanistan and Iraq before ordering invasions of those countries in 2001 and 2003. I'm June Grasso, and you're listening to Bloomberg. Democrats and some Republicans are criticizing President Trump's decision to attack Iran's nuclear sites, saying the strikes were unconstitutional and illegal because Trump didn't get approval from Congress or consult with lawmakers beforehand. In fact, today, House Democratic Caucus Chair Pete Aguilar complained that members of Congress still hadn't gotten a briefing from the Trump administration, though one had been scheduled and then canceled.
It is completely unacceptable that Congress has not been briefed on this in a timely fashion. We need evidence, we need details, and we need to know them now. There are a number of outstanding questions, including whether this attack achieved the administration's stated goals. Launching an attack without congressional authorization is wrong.
But Trump administration officials have said the strikes don't meet the definition of war. And House Speaker Republican Mike Johnson has said he doesn't think a war powers resolution is necessary.
The commander-in-chief has Article 2 responsibilities. They're very serious and important, especially in times like this. I think he used that authority judiciously.
Democratic Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia has introduced a war powers resolution against Trump, seeking to bar the president from taking further military action in Iran without congressional approval. As of yet, a vote on that resolution has not been scheduled. A similar resolution has been introduced by lawmakers from both parties in the U.S. House. I've been talking to Joshua Kastenberg, a professor at the University of New Mexico Law School and a former judge and prosecutor in the U.S. Air Force. Let's talk about an authorization for the use of military force. George W. Bush was the last president to successfully seek an authorization for the use of military force in separate requests in Afghanistan and Iraq before ordering invasions of those countries in 2001 and 2003. Where would that fit in this scenario?
Well, if Congress gives the president the authorization for the use of military force, in many instances, that makes sense, because if you're fighting a non-state actor like al-Qaeda, you can't really declare war on a non-state actor. And so what Congress is essentially saying to a president is, we're going to fund the military campaign against al-Qaeda. Against Iraq, the Congress didn't want to, for whatever reason, declare war against Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government, because it would have been implied, I suppose, that it was a declaration of war against the Iraqi people, and they wanted to avoid that. So they authorized the use of military forces in Iraq, but specifically to remove weapons of mass destruction. So it's like an authorization for the use of force short of a declaration of war, for a defined purpose and an agreement with the executive branch that there will be funding for that military operation. Like I said, it's far short of a declaration of war, but it at least is a constitutional process.
When there are sustained military actions, have presidents in the past generally sought approval from Congress?
Well, yeah. George W. Bush, sought approval from Congress for funding for the authorization for the use of force against both Afghanistan, al-Qaeda, and Iraq. President Obama sought continuing appropriations. I think there was an authorization sought by Ronald Reagan in regard to, the Caribbean island. It seems like so many years ago. Lyndon Johnson sought an authorization for funding for the Dominican Republic operations of 1965. But here, when we have this attack on Iranian nuclear sites, There's been no request for the use of force. It was just done.
Is that sort of in line with what a lot of other presidents have done? I mean, we've seen a lot of targeted attacks ordered by presidents. And it seems like in recent years, neither party has sought to limit the president's authority in matters like this.
Yeah, I mean, this, in a sense, Trump isn't really doing something novel. You can go back to, the Navy patrolling the Straits of Hormuz during the Reagan administration, and we certainly engaged in some firefights with the Iranian military in those days. It's a question about what exactly was permissible in Syria during, the Obama and first Trump administrations. Same with Libya. But there was consultation with Congress during that time. Not necessarily popular support in Congress, but at least there was consultations with Congress over those operations. What sets this apart is it doesn't seem like there was a consultation with Congress before the strike. And I think that makes this situation unique. And some people might say, well, that's incredibly nuanced. But it does separate it from prior military action.
Because there's a difference between informing and consulting.
Well, there is, absolutely. And consulting seems to me that you have trusted leaders in both parties. And you don't just cherry pick and say, well, I'm going to get my yes people around me, the 4 or 5 of them, and say, hey, we're going to do this, but don't share it with anybody else. I mean, consulting means that the committees, the Armed Services Committee or the Intelligence Committee, generally those committees, particularly in the Senate, get along with each other. Those are the non-contentious, committees. Generally, they're trustworthy, and that's who presidents have consulted with.
And congressional leaders are still waiting for their classified briefing that was scheduled for today and then canceled and apparently not rescheduled yet. Thanks so much, Josh. That's Professor Joshua Kastenberg of the University of New Mexico Law School.
Good afternoon. I'm here today with an incredible group of champions, members of Congress, and advocates for reproductive freedom here in the United States of America. Today, we solemnly gather to mark the anniversary of the Dobbs decision, one of the most unconscionable and un-American decisions in the history of the United States of America.
House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries joined with other Democratic members of the House to mark the 3rd anniversary of the Supreme Court decision that took away the constitutional right to abortion established nearly 50 years earlier in the case of Roe v. Wade. The Dobbs decision represented the first time in our country's history that the court has taken away a constitutional right. The decision upended the politics of abortion. 17 states have 6-week or total bans on abortion. And now anti-abortion activists are pushing for new restrictions on prescribing and dispensing mifepristone, the method that has become the most widely used form of abortion care. Today, Democratic Senator Patty Murray of Washington warned about the possible consequences of the review of the data on mifepristone ordered by Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy, Jr.
Trump's FDA recently announced it will undertake a comprehensive review of mifepristone. Why? Because of discredited junk science from the same anti-abortion activists who helped write Project 2025. And unfortunately, we know exactly where this is going. Trump ripping mifepristone off the shelves, reinstating unnecessary restrictions, banning telehealth prescriptions, and curtailing access in every single state.
My guest is healthcare attorney Harry Nelson, a partner at Leech Tishman Nelson Hardiman. Harry, tell us about the landscape of abortion since the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade.
Today is the 3rd anniversary of the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade. So what's happened in the last 3 years is that, depending on how you count, 12 or 13 states have enacted what are effectively near total bans prohibiting abortion in a handful of states to save the mother's life. About 5 or 6 states have passed partial bans by putting early gestational limits where any kind of abortion is banned after a fetal heartbeat is detected, which is usually 6 weeks. So between those two categories, we have 19 or 20 states that have put in bans, and we have a few other states that have put in second trimester bans on abortions that were legal in the time of Roe v. Wade. So that's been a huge restriction. We've had voters in a number of states, voting to keep abortion rights in place in states like Missouri and Arizona, states where they struck down bans. And then there's legislation in at least 10 or 12 states to protect abortion rights more expansively, including to allow doctors in those states to practice across state lines through what are called shield laws. So we've seen really a complete remaking and carving up of the map of different states taking hostile positions, taking protective positions, and a very different looking America than we had with respect to abortion 3 years ago.
Harry, it may seem surprising to some that despite all the states with near or total bans on abortion, that the number of abortions in this country has steadily increased, according to new data from the Society of Family Planning. Explain why the numbers are increasing.
Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon. I think in many ways the discussion of all these abortion restrictions has kind of drawn attention to the availability of abortion via telemedicine and via medications that women can take in the privacy of their own homes. So we've created a much greater level of awareness of abortion options. We've created just a much more educated group of patients who understand what their options are, and we've created options for cross-state patient flow. So we've seen some patients traveling, some patients ordering medications online. So if the goal was to actually shrink the number of total abortions, there's actually not only no evidence that the repeal did that, but we've actually had some kind of a modest increase in the total volume of abortions.
So medication abortion has become the most widely used form of abortion. It accounted for 63% of all abortions nationwide in 2023. But anti-abortion activists are pushing for new restrictions on prescribing and dispensing the abortion drug, mifepristone. And now Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has ordered a review of mifepristone. Is that as ominous as it sounds? Mifepristone has been found to be effective and safe in studies.
So the opening of telemedicine as a means of women getting mifepristone by mail really opened up in the pandemic as a result of the dropping of some of the restrictions on telemedicine and mailing of publications. In the case of abortion, we had a restriction in place through an FDA process called REMS, Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies, by which the medication had only been available on an in-person basis. There was a required in-person review. So that went away basically in 2021, and that had been the law. We had a challenge last year in the Supreme Court where the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that in the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine case that there was no standing to challenge the FDA's authority. But what happened in May last month was that RFK, as Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, he directed the FDA commissioner to review the safety data, essentially to consider whether there are elevated complication rates. Many people who are observing this believe that this was a precursor to essentially a rollback of the allowance for telemedicine and mailing of mifepristone by the FDA and a return to some kind of restriction on the drug. Obviously, there's a lot of concern because the clinical data does not suggest any heightened risk or any problems that are occurring as a result of greater access and accessibility of mifepristone. So a lot of people are worried that what is happening right now is kind of a lead up to an action later this year or next year to kind of roll back the availability of telemedicine and mailing of medications, through FDA restriction.
Has the Trump administration also tried in different ways to restrict access to abortions?
There are a number of other places where we can see that the administration is acting to restrict access to abortion. We've seen a change in the HIPAA privacy rules where certain protections were put in to limit access to records of providers and use privacy to protect interstate, inquiries. That executive order has been essentially canceled by the Trump administration. We've had the Trump administration through Health and Human Services dropping requirements that were imposed in the Biden administration that hospitals must provide abortion in life-threatening emergencies. We've had the Trump administration moving to defund clinics like Planned Parenthood clinics that are providing abortion care. And we've seen over and over again in the filings made on behalf of the FDA through the Trump administration, that there's a backing off of a lot of the protection of abortion. So all of these are kind of little piecemeal steps by which the Trump administration is essentially looking for, whether it's through funding or otherwise through its regulatory strategy and messaging, to be more hostile, certainly, and less supportive of abortion rights.
Are there provisions in the so-called Big Beautiful Bill that would hurt abortion rights?
Yeah, there's several provisions in the Big Beautiful Bill that would have significant implications for abortion access. Certainly, there's language to cut all Medicaid payments to clinics, including Planned Parenthood, that provide abortions. There's a elimination of certain cost-sharing subsidies for Affordable Care Act marketplace exchange policies that cover abortion, sort of forcing individuals who are on those plans to pay out of pocket for that coverage. And there's a broader slashing of, essentially, if the House version passes, $800 billion from Medicaid that would definitely have an impact on limiting access to abortion.
Is it surprising that abortion wasn't a defining issue in the last elections?
It was clear that for a majority of voters, support for abortion, which remains consistent, something not quite 2/3 of all Americans express support for abortion being legal in all or most cases, and less than 10% think it should be, broadly illegal. Nonetheless, that was not a basis upon which people voted in the presidential election. And so it's a really interesting question, how much, the next cycle of elections this fall and next year in the midterms are going to be driven by abortion rights. It's very clear that when you put the abortion issue narrowly before voters, even in socially conservative states, you will find a majority of voters expressing a desire for abortion access in almost all cases. So it's only when you sort of create a more complicated situation of a general election where people have to vote on a whole series of issues that you see abortion dropping as a voting issue. Clearly, we see in the data that women are more supportive than men slightly of abortion. It's a less driving issue for voting. But again, the message to me of the 2024 election is that if there is a complicated enough mix of social and policy issues before voters, abortion is not winning the day as the overriding decision, whether it was the economy or any number of other things. Abortion did not carry the day with voters, and abortion rights did not, in the presidential election. And I think it's going to be an interesting question to see whether that shifts at all as we approach the next election cycle.
So where do you see the battle for abortion rights in the future?
I mean, I think we're clearly seeing that, the state battlegrounds are the centerpiece of the fight. But I think, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens at the FDA and at the Supreme Court. One of the really interesting battles to watch is the battle over shield laws. We currently have doctors in abortion permissive states, or at least one doctor being prosecuted criminally, by hostile abortion restrictive states. And, this battle going on over whether doctors can practice across state lines to provide abortion care. So the Supreme Court's going to have to weigh in on that issue. We're going to have the FDA making some decision on, and the Supreme Court likely also called on to weigh access to mifepristone as the abortion medication. So I do think there's a lot of game left to be played, but I suspect it's less at the ballot box nationally and much more with referenda at the state level and decisions before the federal Supreme Court and state Supreme Courts as this continues to play out.
Thanks so much, Harry. That's healthcare attorney Harry Nelson. And that's it for this edition of the Bloomberg Law Show. Remember, you can always get the latest legal news on our Bloomberg Law podcast. You can find them on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and at www.bloomberg.com/podcast/law. And remember to tune into the Bloomberg Law Show every weeknight at 10 p.m. Wall Street time. I'm June Grasso, and you're listening to Bloomberg.